Hello, this is the Year in Review 1985. I'm Bob Kane.
And I'm Lynn Russell. We look back at the triumphs and the tragedies, the horror and the happiness.
We begin. It was another year of war upon the innocents, a year of terrorism. It reached around the world. In El Salvador, 13 people, including 4 U.S. Marines and 2 American businessmen, were killed June 20th while eating dinner at an outdoor cafe. The day before, a bomb tore through the Frankfurt airport. A mother and her 2 children were killed. And just this week, terrorist teams opened fire with submachine guns and grenades at El Al airline counters in Rome and Vienna. 18 people, including 5 Americans, were killed, more than 100 injured. This year, Americans traveling abroad were the terrorists' targets of choice.
He has pulled a hand grenade pin and he is ready to blow up the aircraft if he has to. We must, I repeat, we must land at Beirut. We must land at Beirut. No alternative.
Millions of Americans awoke to this exchange on the early morning news of June 14th. The TWA jet had left Athens on a routine flight to Rome when 2 heavily armed gunmen diverted the flight to Beirut. It was the first stop on a bizarre journey that saw the jet crisscrossing the Mediterranean for 2 stops in Algiers and 3 in Beirut. Each time, the hijackers released some of the 153 passengers and crew while threatening to kill those left behind. On the second stop in Beirut, 1 passenger was killed, his body dumped on the tarmac. Robert Stedham was 23. He was a Navy diver. Also on the second stop, accomplices scrambled on board. The hijackers were getting help. When the jet settled in Beirut for the 3rd and final time, the hostage total was 37 passengers, 3 crew members. By day 3, the Shiite militia had taken over the aircraft, and leader, Nabi Berri, had emerged as chief negotiator. He revealed the 37 passengers had been split into groups and taken to different locations around Beirut. Only 3 crewmen and their captors remained on the plane. Berri said the move was meant to foil any rescue attempts, and that his men agreed with the original hijackers' chief demand: freedom for more than 700 Lebanese held as prisoners of war in an Israeli jail. But Israel's government said it would not free its Muslim prisoners without a specific request from the White House, and that was something the United States said it wouldn't do.
Let me further make it plain to the assassins in Beirut and their accomplices, wherever they may be, that America will never make concessions to terrorists.
Sit down, sit down, sit down.
Day 7 of the hijack, and 5 hostages appeared at a chaotic news conference.
We as a group want to beseech President Reagan and our fellow Americans to refrain from any form of military or violent means as an attempt, no matter how noble or heroic, to secure our freedom.
The crisis dragged on for more than 2 weeks. 1 passenger was released because of a heart condition, but by day 16, a breakthrough seemed imminent. The hostages were assembled in a Beirut schoolyard.
Robert Gordon Brown.
Roll call, and 4 hostages are not there to answer. They wait. On a trip to Illinois the night before, President Reagan referred to the hijackers as thugs, murderers, and barbarians. Those comments and the missing men delayed the release until the next day. Nabi Berri said the hostages would go nowhere without a promise there would be no retaliation against Lebanon. But on Sunday, the ruffled feathers were soothed, all the hostages were reunited for a journey by caravan to Damascus. Most returned to a welcoming ceremony near Washington, their joy muted by memories of the death of Robert Stedham. It's never been clearly established just why the Achille Lauro was seized as it sailed from an Egyptian port October 7th. Israel claimed the PLO was planning to launch an attack on a port city and that the 4 hijackers seized the cruise ship only after their weapons were discovered. During their 44-hour reign of terror, the hijackers singled out American and British citizens. The pirates agreed to swap their 400 hostages for safe conduct to a secret location. But there were conflicting reports of whether any hostages were killed, and it wasn't until the U.S. ambassador to Egypt boarded the ship that it was determined 1 handicapped American had indeed been killed.
We insist that they prosecute those sons of bitches.
69-year-old Leon Klinghoffer had been shot in the head, his body thrown overboard. Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak claimed the men had been handed over to the PLO. Later, he would say he didn't know at the time that anyone had been killed. But U.S. and Israeli intelligence knew better. And on October 10th, 4 Navy fighters intercepted an Egypt Air jet as it carried the men towards Tunisia. The hijackers are in jail, convicted of weapons charges and facing charges of murder and hijacking. But the United States is still in search of the one who got away. The leader of a PLO splinter group, Mohammed Abu Abbas, is believed to have been the hijacking's mastermind. His whereabouts are still unknown. For the Year in Review, I'm Don Harrison.
Growing determination to fight back against terrorists contributed to the bloodiest hijacking of the year. An Egyptian airliner was commandeered late in November by men said to be from a PLO splinter faction. The plane landed in Malta, where the hijackers began shooting passengers. An Egyptian commando team stormed the plane, killing one of the hijackers and wounding 2. But 57 out of 98 passengers died in the crossfire. In October, Israeli jets flew 1,500 miles to destroy a PLO complex in Tunisia, killing 67 people and almost killing PLO leader Yasser Arafat. 22 of the dead were Tunisians. 100 other people were hurt.
In Lebanon, terrorists continue to hold 6 Americans captive. In February, CNN Bureau Chief Jerry Levin escaped captivity. The Reverend Benjamin Weir was released in September. Another American captive, diplomat William Buckley, was reportedly killed by the kidnappers. British church official Terry Waite was conducting delicate negotiations at year's end to free the others. The kidnappers continue to demand the release of terrorists jailed in Kuwait. The Year in Review continues in 2 minutes.
This time last year, aviation officials were patting themselves on the back. 1984 had been one of the safest in recent history. 1985 was not so kind. It was the worst year in the history of civil aviation. Included in the grim total, the worst single aircraft disaster ever.
JAL Flight 123, videotaped here by an amateur, took off on the eve of a Japanese holiday to honor the dead. The airline had put in extra seats to accommodate the extra travelers going home for the holiday. Total number of passengers and crew, 524 people. After takeoff, the 747's tail section began to break up. The flight crew struggled to maintain some sort of control. After almost half an hour, the jet hit this mountain, killing all but 4 people on board, the death toll 520. Some passengers had taken time to scribble out final notes to families and loved ones. A businessman who died in the crash wrote his last words to his young son. "Live strongly," he wrote, "grow up and be a fine man." 2 days after the crash, the president of JAL announced he was taking responsibility for the wreck and would resign. It was the worst single airplane disaster ever. 10 days after the JAL crash, 55 people were killed when a fire broke out aboard a British Air Tours 737. The blaze erupted after the Pratt & Whitney engine exploded during takeoff at Manchester International Airport. 83 people survived. Pratt & Whitney ordered all similar engines pulled from use and inspected to make sure the accident wouldn't happen again. 136 of the 162 people aboard Delta Flight 191 died when the L-1011 went down at the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport in August. 1 man on the ground also died. Most of the survivors were in the back of the plane, the smoking section. Said one survivor, "That's the first time a cigarette ever saved my life." Wind shear was tentatively blamed for the crash.
I did notice that there was what appeared to be fire in the vicinity of the left wing. And as soon as I said Dell to go around, he made a sharp left turn, nose down, wing down, impacted the ground, and bounced into the water tanks and exploded.
It still isn't known what caused an Air India 747 to break up and crash into the Atlantic in June, killing all 329 people aboard. A massive underwater search finally pulled up the flight recorders from the ocean floor. One searcher said it was like finding a needle in a mile-deep haystack. Aviation experts looking at the data believe an explosion, perhaps from a bomb, may have caused the crash. Some investigators believe Sikh Indian terrorists could be to blame. 2 Sikhs in Canada were arrested as part of the investigation into the crash. In January, the day after the Super Bowl, the so-called Gamblers Special Charter crashed on takeoff in Reno. 68 people were killed instantly. 2 others died later. Only a 17-year-old boy survived. In Spain, an Iberia Airlines crash killed all 148 people aboard in February. The jet hit an unlighted television tower. While the crash of a Midway Express DC-9 moments after takeoff from Milwaukee killed 31 in September. December 12th, another 256 names added to the list of those killed in air disasters. Most were members of the Army's 101st Airborne Division, heading home for the holidays after a tour of duty as part of an international peacekeeping force in the Mideast. Their chartered Arrow Air DC-8 had just refueled in Gander, Newfoundland, when it crashed immediately after takeoff. There were no survivors. For the Year in Review, I'm Mark Leff.
Springtime brought disaster to one of the world's poorest and most heavily populated countries. A cyclone struck the coast of Bangladesh in late May. As many as 10,000 people died in what is called that country's worst disaster. 4.5 months later, torrential rainstorms triggered mudslides that buried a hillside shantytown in Ponce, Puerto Rico. Up to 150 people died in that calamity.
Thousands more died in Central and South American disasters. In Colombia, a long-dead volcano came to life. Nearby, unsuspecting towns were buried like modern-day Pompeii's. In Chile and later in Mexico City, earthquakes destroyed hundreds of buildings and thousands of lives.
Pain and anguish touched the lives of thousands as Latin America suffered through one of its worst years of natural disasters. Earthquake and volcanic eruption disrupted 3 countries, Colombia, Chile, and Mexico, inflicting major human and economic toll. Hardest hit was the world's most populous metropolitan area, Mexico City. More than 500 high-rise buildings were leveled on the morning of September 19 by a powerful earthquake measuring 7.8 on the Richter scale. The city's 3 main hospitals, crowded with patients and medical staff, were wrecked, as were hotels, government buildings, factories, and schools. Even as the massive rescue effort was underway, a second earthquake struck, panicking an already frightened population and sending thousands fearfully into the streets. Frantic rescue efforts were sometimes successful. Workers believed it was a miracle that this child survived after 2 days buried in the wreckage. But in the weeks that followed, more than 20 newly born babies were recovered from destroyed hospital maternity wards, leaving the medical world in wonderment at their survival. But many more died in the ruins than lived. In the Nuevo Leon apartment building, more than 800 bodies were recovered, and grieving relatives could identify only a handful of the estimated 20,000 Mexico City residents who perished in the worst earthquake the country has seen. An earthquake of similar severity struck the coast of Chile in March, leaving 1 million homeless. But fortunately, the death toll was only in the hundreds. An angry nature, though, was still not through with Latin America. It struck again, this time in Colombia. The long-dormant Nevado del Ruiz volcano high in the Andes erupted November 13, triggering mudslides that cascaded down mountain streams, burying the town of Amero 30 miles away. The coffee processing center was caught totally unprepared and was 80% destroyed. Thousands were entombed in their homes in dirt up to 20 feet deep. The few survivors had to be painstakingly extracted from their muddy prisons. One man, freed after 2 days, had watched his friend die. Rescuers frantically attempted to free a 13-year-old girl, but she died after 3 days trapped in the water. Survivors found clinging to trees were ferried to safety after the eruption. Bodies were washed up on riverbanks far from the disaster's center. As the population fled to higher ground, officials estimated that 23,000 died in Colombia's violent volcanic eruption, and many of the bodies will never be recovered. American assistance was rapidly deployed to all 3 disaster areas. Volunteer American doctors spent weeks in Mexico City helping the sick and homeless recover. Permanent tent cities sprang up in the devastated suburbs. American demolition experts began collapsing structures rendered unsafe by the earthquake. And Mexico's leaders drew up plans to move key government departments out of the capital to lessen the danger during future earthquakes. In Colombia, the first priority was to open the mud-caked roads to Amero. Thousands of residents were waiting to be resettled, and volcanologists were carefully watching the Andean mountain chain for warnings of future violent eruption. For the Year in Review, I'm Peter Arnett.
Hurricanes have been called the fiercest storms on Earth, and not since 1916 have so many of them made landfall. Beginning with Danny in August, ending with Kate in November, 6 storms forced thousands of people from their homes and did about $4 billion in damage. Thanks to early warnings and massive evacuations, the death toll was minimal. The Year in Review returns in just a moment. January 20th, Ronald Wilson Reagan took his second oath of office following his landslide victory last November. But the weather was not nearly as kind as the voters. The record-breaking cold that gripped the East Coast canceled most of the outdoor celebrations. Mr. Reagan took the oath inside. The president's 1985 Soviet counterpart was not yet in office. Konstantin Chernenko died in March at age 73 after months of poor health. In his place, 54-year-old Mikhail Gorbachev, the 4th leader in 3 years. A youngster by Kremlin standards, he was named General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union.
President Reagan accused the Soviet Union of being the evil empire and stalling U.S.-Soviet arms talks. Mr. Gorbachev argued against Star Wars, saying Mr. Reagan was a cowboy. The rhetoric was thick, and so it came to pass the two leaders of the greatest powers on Earth met face-to-face, fireside in Geneva.
It was President Reagan's first summit meeting with a Soviet leader. It was Mikhail Gorbachev's first summit meeting with an American president. And it was one of the most unusual of all the superpower get-togethers since World War II. The meeting in Geneva followed months of suspense and propaganda skirmishes in which first one side gained the advantage and then the other. The Soviet Union said the big issue was arms control, and especially the elimination of President Reagan's space defense plan, the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars. The U.S. said arms control was an issue, but not the only one, and Star Wars was not negotiable. President Reagan, the great communicator, didn't budge an inch on that point when he sat down with Gorbachev at Geneva. The new Soviet leader, a formidable communicator in his own right, didn't stop insisting that any progress on arms control depends on scrapping Star Wars. The Geneva summit, with no agreement on issues of substance, had all the ingredients of a miserable failure, and yet somehow it came off as a success for both sides and both leaders.
I leave Geneva today and our fireside summit determined to pursue every opportunity to build a safer world of peace and freedom. There's hard work ahead, but we are ready for it. General Secretary Gorbachev, we ask you to join us in getting the job done, as I'm sure you will. Thank you.
On a personal level, the two leaders hit it off pretty well. There were smiles, jokes, cordiality at their fireside chats, and much to the chagrin of 6,000 or so journalists in Geneva, a total news blackout. Their wives, Nancy Reagan and Raisa Gorbachev, exchanged tea and chit-chat in another display of personal cordiality. Everybody got along so well that 2 more summits were scheduled, one in Washington in 1986 and in Moscow the following year. Both leaders agreed on perhaps the most important point of all. There can be no winners in a nuclear war. Gorbachev, still in his 50s, is definitely a new look in Soviet leadership. The tired old men who ruled the Kremlin for 2 decades are long gone, and now a tough, dynamic, sophisticated, articulate leader is in charge. Gorbachev knows how to use Western media to make his case, and he impresses Western leaders like Britain's Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. He moves around a lot, meeting leaders in London, Paris, and other capitals. He mingles with ordinary Soviet workers in factories and on farms. For the first time in memory, a Soviet leader's wife has become an international celebrity, admired for her good looks, intelligence, and charm. Raisa Gorbachev is a long way from the mostly anonymous, grandmotherly, and frankly dumpy Kremlin wives of the past. The success of the Geneva summit on the personal level only briefly obscured its failure to make any progress in arms control. But the two leaders passed the word to the Geneva arms negotiators to accelerate their efforts to reach agreement. For the Year in Review, I'm Molly McCoy.
Scandals stole